Good afternoon, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Digging Deeper into Security and Compliance Basics with HIPAAtrek. My name is Mike Annan, and I will be your host for the day. Before we start, I'd like to go over some basic webinar housekeeping tips. First, everyone is currently on mute and will remain so throughout the broadcast. Hold on a second, I lost my script. There we go. Please use the chat window to inform us of any audio or technical issues. If you experience sound issues or anything during the broadcast, please use the chat or call in to use the audio on your phone rather than your computer. We are going to conduct 3 live polls throughout the webinar, so please feel free to interact with us. It helps us to better tailor the presentation to you when we know where you are in your compliance journey. Throughout the webinar, please use the question feature to ask any questions of the topics that are being discussed. We will address these at the end of the presentation, but sometimes you might forget your question, so go ahead and enter it as soon as you think about it. There's no such thing as a dumb question, and we want to have lots of interaction today. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants post-event. With us today, we have HIPAAtrek's CEO and founder, Sarah Bademan. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Sarah to y'all. Sarah, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. So we are so excited to be part of this webinar with Armor. So we are a client of Armor, but we also align very well because security and compliance, you cannot have one without the other. So I am the founder of HIPAAtrek, which actually was born out of my own need as a former healthcare administrator for a need to administrate and manage our compliance on an ongoing basis, because I recognized that compliance and security and privacy were not checkbox things that I needed to accomplish, but rather an entire program that I needed to put in place, and frustrated that I couldn't find a solution out there to solve my need, I decided to partner up with an amazing team to create HIPAAtrek. And we also host a lot of different free educational opportunities for the community, a lot of which Mike Annan actually participates on with us, such as our HIPAA Huddle and our podcast, Armchair HIPAA.
Awesome. We're so happy to have you. Let's, well, you can see that's what we look like when we clean up. Actually, I've shaved my face since this picture was taken. But let's look at our agenda for today. Today, we're going to be talking about ways that y'all can improve your security without really increasing your budget. We'll talk about how to analyze your current environment. We'll talk about securely working remote, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A session. So we're going to jump right into it, improving security without increasing your budget. But first, let's have a poll question.
All right, so it's a myth or fact. You need to use expensive, top-of-the-line platforms in order to have the best security for your company. So let us know whether or not you think this is a myth or a fact. We'll give you guys just a few more seconds to answer before Gwen ends the poll. All right, so 91% thought it was a myth. Congratulations, that is the correct answer. You do not need expensive top-of-the-line platforms to have the best security for your company. Mike, tell us a little bit about what they need to do to actually secure it.
Well,
okay,
there's a bunch of things that we can do, right? So, Sarah, this is one of your quotes.
I love it.
Why this is important to you, and what's the meaning behind this quote?
So, The Art of War, Sun Tzu, right, is an amazing book that a lot of business folks actually draw inspiration from. But in cybersecurity and in compliance, we can also draw a lot of inspiration from it. And every battle is won before it's fought is really, really important in cybersecurity, because we are in a battle, y'all. And one of the best things that we can do is actually plan and create a strategy, which is how these battles are won. and the best thing that you can do before you ever even get started on trying to improve your security is understand where your security sits today. And that starts with doing a security risk analysis. And that's the best way to start winning that battle before you ever even draw a weapon.
How would you suggest people do let's say I've never done a risk assessment before. How do I start? Do I need to hire somebody to do that?
No, you don't need to hire somebody. But there are a number of different ways that you can do a security risk analysis, and it really depends on how complex your organization is. The more complex your organization and the more complex your attack surfaces, so how big is your network, how many workstations you have, what type of data do you have, and how are you transmitting and storing that information. So the more complex that is, the more complex your security risk analysis is going to naturally be, right? And so some people are going to say there's only one way to do a security risk analysis, which is complete garbage. There is a ton of different ways you can do it. So you can do a questionnaire. You can include it, certain elements of your security process, like your information system security review, your log review, your vulnerability scans, a penetration test. All of those elements are things that you can incorporate into a risk assessment or a risk analysis. So the only thing that's really important to remember is that you're honest with yourself if you're doing it yourself, and you're honest with your vendor if you hire a vendor to do that security risk analysis. I know one of the things that we see at HIPAAtrek is everybody just wanting to pass the security risk analysis, and there's no such thing as passing, because you're going to always have risk. Everything that we do is an element of risk management. We are calculating the risk of harm before we do anything. And this is even if you're just stepping off the sidewalk to cross the street, you're calculating the risk. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that's what you're doing when you're doing the risk analysis, is you are calculating your risk and the impact to your organization if it were to stay the same. And then if you're going to change something, that's a whole other process, a change management process, where you're also doing risk management and risk consideration.
Truly, very, very good points. It's also something that I like to point out too, that it's not just your GRC's team responsibility to track the risk. Really, it's everybody's responsibility. When you identify something that might be a risk to your organization, document it. Put it on. If all you're using is a spreadsheet, that's fine, but you still need to document those risks. You need to track them over time. So let me give you a prime example. We introduced a software at a previous company that had to be patched outside of our normal standard operating procedure, which not such a big deal, but when you think about it in the long term, when you have these one-offs, right, then you're going to have to go through the standard and then, got to remember to patch this other application in this special way. So that's a risk, because things can fall through the cracks, and it's a piece of knowledge, right, that has to be passed on. And so what you do is you put a risk in there, and then you put it in an expiration date on it, right? You have to do that, because what happens is your risk appetite changes over time. The things that you may be okay with today, you may not be okay with in a year's time. So let that risk bubble back up in a year and look at it and say, is this still a good idea for us? Has the risk changed? Is it more impactful? Is it less likely? Can we eliminate this risk somehow? So that's really how you need to think about it, how you need to manage those risks. Number one, you got to have everybody identifying them. Don't believe that it's just a GRC's responsibility to identify them, because their exposure to things is limited, just like the development teams is limited. So if we have everybody identifying risks and tracking them in a centralized location, then it's much easier to become more mature as an organization. So keep that in mind. Document and track over time. Let's talk about oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you have something, Sarah?
Oh, I would say absolutely. No, I'm just agreeing with all those beautiful nuggets you just dropped.
Oh, good. Let's talk about online backups. So over time, so if you think about how we used to do backups 15, 20 years ago, it was all tape backup, right? Everything was, you had to have a special dedicated machine that had backup software, or maybe had agents running on different endpoints. And the backups were pulling in, being written to tape. It was very time consuming and somewhat expensive because that media degrades over time, and you have to replace tapes, and tapes were not cheap. But as storage became cheaper and cheaper, it really became apparent that we should all be moving to online backups. And this creates a much better opportunity to create security within your environment, because number one, it's easier to back things up. And also you can have, rather than boxing up those tapes and having a vendor come and pick them up and take them to some offsite storage, we can now export those to an offline location or offsite storage, and then take those backups offline so that they're available when we need them. We just have to execute the storage back online. So much easier. You can do it digitally. You can have a network connection to your offsite storage, and you can send them automatically, right? You execute your backups. Once the backup job completes, ship that backup offsite. It also provides an opportunity for enriched security features, right? So you can be much more, how should I say, picky about who you allow access to, right? When you have backup media, anybody that can go into that room and access that media can actually put that drive or put that tape into a server that can access it. With offline, online backups, you can make sure that the right people have access to it. So that enriches the security features of the backups. And then, of course, the encryption is something that comes along with that, very easy to execute. So, think about that. If you're still using tape backups, how are you managing those backups? Look at maybe some, using hard drives for your backup media rather than tapes or what have you. Let's talk now about how to analyze your current environments. And when we switch to a new topic, what are we going to do? We're going to have a poll question.
A poll. And while we're waiting for your vote on this, I'm going to read this poll, I promise. But then I'm going to also tell a story on the backup. So myth or fact, capacity planning is all about realizing your processing power and planning accordingly for different solutions. So let us know if this is a myth or a fact. And while we wait for y'all's answers, I'm going to tell you a story about when I was doing a risk analysis for a small critical access hospital on the backup. We do believe that when I went into their basement on their domain server, they actually had an external hard drive that was their backup plugged in at all times to that domain server. We never want to do that, y'all. Even if you're going to do on-site backups and you're not going to move to the cloud or to an off-site process, do not ever leave your backup plugged in at all times, because then you can get all of your data corrupt. All right, so I think we're done with this poll, and 71% said a fact. Mike, what do you think the correct response is on this one?
Well, it's interesting because I think it is a fact, but I think of capacity planning in terms of IT, right? So that may not be the case, really, if you're thinking about hospital beds, right? It's not all about processing power, right? And we talked about this a little bit yesterday. So it's funny when we go through these things, I immediately jump into my IT role and start thinking about capacity planning in the way of CPU utilization, disk space IO, and disk space utilization, memory utilization, those kind of things. How much traffic is coming to the site, those kind of things. But really, capacity planning in terms of business continuity means looking at all the things that may limit your ability to provide service to your customers. And that absolutely includes the number of beds. And certainly with COVID-19, we had an exercise where, geez, hospitals were getting close to capacity. I believe some of them, and I know India right now is really having a tough problem with, capacity in their hospitals. So, Sarah, how do you feel about this?
So one, I want to remind you to share the screen.
Oh.
But also, I think you're absolutely correct. So when I think about capacity planning, maybe because I come from more of a clinical background, I think of how we can actually loop in the capacity for everything, because everything in a hospital setting or a clinic setting is like connected and touches, and you have to have thought process for everything. And this was really highlighted during COVID, like you said, right? So we had increased emergency room visits. We had lack of beds for COVID patients, particularly in ICU situations. We had, I mean, it was just completely highlighted how our clinical response did not match what the needed response was. And so this is one of the things when a hospital is thinking about emergency planning, capacity planning has to be an element of that emergency planning. And we need to not forget about our security and our compliance in the thought process behind that, right? So definitely patients come first, because that is our mission. That is the whole reason why we're doing anything. It's the culture of any clinic or any hospital is to first take care of that patient. So we have to think about how our infrastructure, including our IT infrastructure and our network, actually impacts that ability for us to plan and deliver that patient care. And so I think of it kind of as a very holistic approach, and that you can't segment or silo these different business units out when you're looking at your clinic or when you're looking at your hospital. It has to be seen very holistically, and one thing is going to definitely impact the other. I mean, and we see this all the time, right? When you see increased patient numbers, right? So you have an increased population inside of your hospital, then you're going to see a drastic impact to your network, because they're all on your guest Wi-Fi, and no matter how much you try to segment, it's still going to pull from your regular Wi-Fi. You're going to see increased foot traffic, and now during the pandemic, that's an element of something that we need to consider. And with that increase of foot traffic, and with how everybody's staying like socially distanced, hopefully we need to worry about the physical security. Are you correctly keeping people out of areas of your hospital that they are not supposed to be in? Because we have really taken a step back from our physical security during this time, and we need to think about that as well. So I do think of it from the whole perspective.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So when we think about, doing an analysis of our current environment, one of the things that you can do is a business impact assessment or a business impact analysis. And basically what you're doing is you're looking at your organization, and you are defining those things that drive the business, correct? So like, I'll give you a prime example. I worked for a retailer and supported their e-commerce website. And so this application was one of their critical applications. You would call it a tier 1 application because it generated revenue, right? Now, keep in mind, this retailer, we sold socks, right? Does not necessarily mean that it needed to be as critical as a hospital system, that where lives may depend on the availability of those applications. But Sarah, let me ask you, when I say business impact analysis, what does that mean to you?
Again, because I think of everything from a very holistic standpoint, I think that the business impact assessment or analysis is a organization-driven activity, right? And whereas I think the contingency plan, I typically think of that as more of an IT or security thing, although contingency plans can be operational. Right. So when I think about the BIA, I'm thinking about each business unit actually understanding where they fit inside of the greater picture, right? And so you scope everything out when you do the BIA. It's almost like a risk assessment, except for you're not trying to find risk. You're trying to see where everything correlates and crosses over, and where, honestly, it's a budget planning activity as well. Where does money need to be spent, and where can we actually save a little bit of money? And it's also thinking about disasters, right? So if something does happen, how are we going to facilitate the critical functions of each business unit? And so if you don't understand what those critical functions are and you don't communicate that across the key stakeholders within that business unit, it becomes very difficult to be able to actually do your contingency planning. And so I think a lot of folks will actually utilize business impact assessments and contingency plans as interchangeable terms. And I believe that they are similar but different.
Okay. How long do you think it takes to do a business impact analysis? Can I do it in a week?
Oh gosh, no. Not even if you have to think one, can you update one in a week?
Right.
Because these are incredibly thoughtful and like work intense things, and it is something that takes multiple people to do it and do it properly. And again, you can't just throw this on your operations team and say, okay, my operations team is going to do my BIA. No, it is every business unit and multiple stakeholders within every business unit. And then you may even have senior leadership involved in each one of the business unit discussions to get a BIA done. And so it can take months to do a BIA. It can take years if you're a very large organization. And this is also why you don't want to try to eat the whole elephant in one bite. No matter how big or how small you are, break this off into pieces. Otherwise, you're going to be very overwhelmed trying to figure it out. Think about what is critical to you staying in operations. And so when I like to look at it, if somebody's never done a business impact assessment before, especially when I'm talking with my hospitals and large clinics, I tell them the very first thing that you need to look at is all of your clinical operations and think of that as a business unit. Then you need to think about your billing, coding, and HIM departments. And buried in HIM is typically your privacy or your HIPAA privacy compliance, right? And all of that needs to be done in one. And then you have to look at your IT, because without IT, you cannot support your clinical or your HIM functions. And so those are the three, like the first three that you need to do. And then you can worry about all your other business groups that you can work through a BIA. But very first, you need to work through that clinical piece if you're a hospital or a clinic.
Fantastic. And Sarah, I'm going to steal from you on what you said about the risk assessment. I think it's really important to point out here that the business impact assessment also, you really need to be honest with yourself. You cannot come out of this assessment and say that everything is critical, because when you do that, when everything is critical, nothing is critical. And so make sure that you're being very thoughtful, very thorough in your evaluations. You can start at a very high level. You certainly won't be done when you do it at a high level, because you can really get lost in the details when you're going through this exercise. So start with each department, find out the things that drives that department. What are the things that are important to them? And then when you start assessing those applications and analyzing the infrastructure and identifying single points of failure, you're going to have to take those assessments and compare them to the other departments, or the analysis that you come out of with other departments. Because just because an application is critical to one department does not mean it's going to have the same criticality as maybe a life support system or a billing function that generates revenue, right? So you need to then what's the word I'm looking not coagulate, correlate the data. Man,
there you go.
English is hard sometimes. You need to correlate the data so that it's meaningful across the entire organization, right? And then you can begin building your infrastructure around those requirements that are coming out of the business impact assessment. And you can see how contingency plans are related to the business impact assessment, because those plans are based upon the things you find out in the business impact assessment. So now you're going to look at your systems and your services and the data that is being collected, and then you're going to build your data, your disaster recovery systems to meet those business needs, right? IT doesn't get to define, what's critical or what the RTO, RPO is on a particular application. Those things are defined by the business, and IT is there to support business function, to help drive those business functions, and so that the company can be successful, right? So
and to that point, I love that you pointed that out, that IT is there as a supporting business group. and not the one that actually is the decider of all of these elements. Because so many times when we work with at HIPAAtrek, when we're working with these hospitals and clinics, they just offload everything to IT. Like everything is IT responsibility, and IT has no idea. They can't decide what's critical and what's not. This is especially like when we're talking about our connected devices. These are like life-saving devices that are like life support machines and your other like connected medical devices that are connected to your network, and you're trying to let IT decide how long those should be down. IT is going to say 72 hours, and they're not going to think about a backup plan to that because they're not clinical. They're not going to understand, and they're going to say, I'm sorry, that's how long it's going to take because here's how I've prioritized this, which is what you told me to do. And this is, when you think about it from that example, it's an extreme example, but it really highlights why all of this activity is a multidisciplinary approach. You have to take a multidisciplinary approach. Compliance, not only IT and HIM's problem. Security, not just IT's problem. You have to make it a multidisciplinary approach because it is a business problem.
Absolutely. Now, I understand a lot of the folks in the audience probably already had their infrastructure in place when they got these business requirements, the RTO and RPO. And listen, I understand. You cannot get blood from a stone no matter how hard you squeeze it, and you cannot wish uptime into existence. If the requirements are something you can't meet, you're going to probably have to re-architect that environment to meet those requirements, or you're just going to have to go back to the business side and say we can't meet that objective. So be honest.
Right. Which is be honest with yourself. That's probably the best advice that we can give, right, Mike?
Yep.
But it's also like why you should actually revisit your RPO and RTOs throughout time, right? So whenever you're doing your application and data criticality analysis, which is the ADCA under the BIA, right? So whenever you're doing that, look through your RPO and RTOs. I know at HIPAAtrek, we always highlight or emphasize how important that RPO and RTO is. That is extremely important, and that is an important activity for every element of your cybersecurity program.
Yep. For those in the audience that may not understand what RPO and RTO are, let me explain to you. Let me explain it to you real quick, and hopefully this will help bring some clarity to it. So RTO is the restore time objective. What that means is once an outage occurs, how long does it take to restore service? So if you think in terms of a timeline, when you have an outage, the RTO will be forward on the timeline. RPO is the restore point objective. That's the last good data that you can restore, right? That's going to be behind the event on the timeline, right? So you have your outage, you have to look back at your backup, see when was the last good database that we can restore to that RTO ahead of the event, if that makes sense. So you have your event on the timeline, forward is your restore time objective, behind the event is restore point objective. And here's the kicker, right? The closer those two objectives are to the actual event, the more money it's going to cost you, right? So if you need like a critical application, if it goes down and you need it back up within 30 minutes, that's a very expensive ask for IT. And so you're talking about maybe an active situation between multiple data centers, some sort of automatic failover when your load balancer sees that, let's say your Dallas data center is down, it can immediately switch over to your Columbus data center. Of course, I'm just using some examples. You may not have a Columbus data center or a Dallas data center, but you get the idea, right? And so also with the data restore, you're probably going to have some sort of real-time data replication in order to facilitate those very short time windows for RTO and RPO. So just keep in mind when these asks come through, like I said, you may have already architected stuff. So you may have to think about how are we going to go forward. I would suggest maybe some cloud adoption might be helpful, some sort of virtualization. These things can aid in the quick turnaround when a disaster does happen. I think we beat that to death. Let's talk a little bit more about capacity planning. So we've been joking about this slide and the capacity of this guy's pants to encompass those ankles. So from an IT standpoint, when I think about capacity planning, and I said this, I think about resources in your environment and why it's important, right? Because in terms of business continuity, you need to know what the trends are with your environment. What utilization, what has it been doing for the last 6 months? Is it pinging out every day at 10 o'clock? Why is it pinging out at 10 o'clock? What does your disk utilization look like? If you're running out of space, you need to be tracking that so that the system doesn't fail when it runs out of disk space, right? This is called avoiding the avoidable, right? It's a simple thing of looking at trends and making sure that you have the capacity going forward. Understanding, if you have maybe some sort of influx of patients during a certain season, right? If people come and get their checkups during the summertime, if you can track those trends, then you can make sure that you have the facilities, the people available. So it's not just IT functions, right? It's anything and everything you need to provide that service. So understand what feeds into the capacity and then track those trends and make sure that you're planning and that because it used to be like when we had physical servers, we had to plan 6 months in advance, right? We would talk to the business and say, well, we expect a 20% increase this Christmas season over last year. So we had to have that data early, and so we could start ramping up for that capacity, right? So virtual technology is a whole lot easier.
I want to point out here too, like we were talking about the clinical aspect of this too, is because a lot of people don't consider clinical capacity as part of their cybersecurity and compliance program. But again, it all comes down into that attack surface that you're creating as you have more people entering into your hospital, more people entering into your clinic. And we saw this again, especially during COVID, because we sent a lot of people to work from home and we laid off a ton of people, y'all, a ton of people that still have not been given positions back at your hospital. Those positions are still not available to them. And again, it goes back to the physical security of your hospital or your clinic. Are you really addressing that? And this is particularly for hospitals, less so for clinics because they have smaller physical spaces. But for hospitals especially, like, are you addressing this? And how are you addressing this now that you don't have as many eyeballs on all these private doors, right? Have you increased your physical barriers in any way? When you're thinking about how you're starting to allow patients back into your hospitals now for different surgeries and different things, what are you doing as far as helping to make sure that you still have network capacity? Because again, it does affect, and I've seen it affect it, right? So a lot of people are like, oh no, I segmented that off. I mean, at the critical access hospital that I was at, we thought that too. We thought, oh, we segmented our guest network from our regular network, but it's still all tied together, y'all. And it can still bleed over.
Absolutely, absolutely, it can. In Texas, back in February, we had a little cold spell. They call it the Texas blizzard, what have you. But the whole thing was a capacity planning nightmare, right? The demand, they recognized that the demand was going to be higher than normal, right? So they wanted a bunch of power plants to come online to satisfy that demand. But the problem was we were doing rolling blackouts, right? And there's this thing called critical infrastructure, and you have to fill out a form to be labeled as critical infrastructure so that you can avoid being part of the rolling blackouts, right? So think about hospitals, think about clinics or retirement homes, or yes, even power plants, right? Several of the power plants did not fill out the paperwork to be excluded from the rolling blackouts. That just led to a disaster of epic proportion, right? It just compounded the issue. We were already at a shortfall of capacity, and now power plants that needed to come online and stay online couldn't because they were part of the rolling blackouts. We also saved a little bit of money in Texas by, not buying the heaters for the turbines, and equipment that's outside during, 4-degree weather when it's raining and snowing and sleeting. Those things are going to ice over. So we saved a couple $1 million, but in the end, that whole blizzard has cost like $195 billion, and 100 people lost their lives for the sake of a couple $1 million. Not worth it. So make sure that you're understanding what the capacity demands are for your organization. Make sure you're evaluating that stuff and that you're getting things in shape for that that demand to come through, right? So it's not enough just to have, to be thinking about it. You actually have to have those resources on hand when demand is asking for it.
Exactly.
Yes. There's also the thing, I like to call it the shiny object syndrome, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, right?
Why?
Well, because we like the new technology, right? Technology is neat. We like the Alexa in our home, right? Because we can tell it to play our favorite playlist, and it's secure, right? It's not listening all the time, right?
Oh, well, I mean, that goes into our next poll question. So why don't we go ahead and get that started?
Let's do it.
So myth or fact, smart devices like Google Homes or Alexa Dot only listen when they're addressed or activated by saying, "Hey, Alexa." Is this a myth or a fact? Mike almost gave this away, y'all. He almost told y'all the answer.
I want to think that it's only when I talk to my Amazon Echo that it's listening, because there are things I say in my home that I would not like other people to hear.
Ooh, I have a story for you.
No, I want to hear it.
96% people say that it's a myth, and they are correct. Those devices are always listening, y'all. Always listening. So if you ever want to know what your Alexa or your Google Dot are actually recording, you can log into your account and listen to all those recordings. And remember, it's the internet. So once it's out there, it's out there. So just because you delete it off of your account does not mean it's really deleted off the Amazon servers. And so this becomes very important when we're talking about working securely from home. Like, I'll go ahead, I'll stop talking. I'll let you actually do your thing.
No, that's funny. And the reason I'm laughing is because I've gone back and listened to those recordings, and you can tell when I'm frustrated when Alexa won't do what I want her to do. And I start using some very colorful language, and it's all recorded on the internet for everyone to hear. Dadgummit, Alexa, that's not what I asked for.
I know, I work because I've got 4 kids. And I wonder if Amazon thinks that I'm like a super mean parent, because I'm always like, if the Amazon that's in the kitchen is the one that I think that I'm exposed to the most. And I'm always saying, "Leave me alone. Go away."
So,
leave me alone.
Sarah, what does it mean to you to be securely working remote? Now, I love this picture. That's such a nice little work environment.
I know, I want that, right? I want the cat rubbing up against me while I'm drinking my hot coffee with a heart floating in my background.
Nice.
I want that for my life.
Perfectly healthy plant. Yeah, very nice. Clean desk space.
Yeah, I mean, she's living her best life, and I'm a little bit jealous.
Yeah.
So what it means to work securely from home is, one, obviously disconnecting all those smart devices while we are working. Now, you can turn them back on to yell at your children later, but while you're working, you need to unplug those, especially if you're dealing with patient information, right? So if it would be considered electronic health information under information blogging, or electronic protected health information under HIPAA, you need to make sure that those devices are nowhere near. You also need to be very careful with bring your own device, right? So this became extremely popular when EMRs were first introduced to us, and then got even more and more popular through COVID, when we didn't have enough workstations for everybody. Hold on. Sorry, they keep closing the sliding door, and I'm like burning up, y'all. So I had to mute myself. Just please don't close the door. I know I'm loud. But anyway, so the bring your own device. If you are allowing folks to utilize their personal devices, cool, go ahead, allow it. However, make sure that your IT or your security person has actually reviewed that. Make sure that compliance has a policy for it, and you have a log that everybody that's using a personal device, what type of device it is, and where that device is going to be located, so that you have actual control over that. Then make sure that you're training your employees that if they're using their personal device and they're accessing patient information on that, they can't then turn that over to their spouse or to their child to play on or work on. That becomes a work device, even though it's owned by the employee. So those are some of the key things for us to consider when we're working from home. And then if you're doing telehealth, which is another thing, is making sure that you're still considering patient privacy, right? Your spouse and your children are not allowed to listen to your patient encounters. You have to do those in a private and secure place. You have to go to a bedroom, go to a back office, kick your family out of the living room if you have no better place to do it other than your living room. But you have to make sure that you're not giving patient care in front of anybody else. Once we're allowed to go back out into the world again, make sure that you're not doing it at a Starbucks or at a hotel lobby. Connecting to hotel Wi-Fi is a whole other thing that we can probably do an entire webinar on why that's a bad idea. But essentially, working securely is essentially using your best judgment. Working from home, you have to consider that little setup that you have at home, just like you would your office, and treat it the same. It's almost like tempting to treat it like your home because it is your home. I'm done. Off my soapbox. So sorry.
No worries. I always like to remind people too, there are times, and COVID was a perfect example, where we are forced to, course correct on our processes and implement technology quickly to, solve an immediate need, whether that's an outage or something, as devastating as COVID-19 was, where we all of a sudden disperse our workforce. After you have time to catch your breath and things settle down a little bit, it's very important that you go back and you evaluate the things that you implemented in that, rush to, implement secure methods or maybe not so secure methods. Evaluate it. Let your security team make course corrections. You need to, update your policies if you're going to allow, a majority of your workforce to be at home during the day, or if you're going to allow them to use their own equipment. Those policies need to be updated, and you need to enforce those policies and make sure that the people that are working from home understand what's in them, right? And so there's technology that you can use too. You can use tunneling, right? So if you do end up having to work from Starbucks, make sure that they're using some sort of VPN tunnel to protect that traffic. Make sure they're utilizing multi-factor authentication. So think about the ways you can secure those connections and those devices that people are bringing. And like I said, update the policies. Then you need to give some thought to how you're going to protect that data, right? When everybody was in the office, we had the data, secured within the office environment, and people could access it and not really cause a problem. But if they're pulling that data now down to their personal devices, how are you managing? Do they have? Are they allowed to print it? That needs to be something you can consider. If they do print it, how are they securely destroying that? Or do they have? Are you issuing shredders to everybody? Think about that. Do they, have to bring those documents back and put it in a secure shred bin? These are things that you need to think about and discuss with your workforce. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else? Data loss prevention?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider there. Oh, Indeed. This is my favorite slide, Mike.
Yes.
Top 10 ways to suck at compliance.
So this is a list of things that I compiled a while back, and the list continues to grow. Sarah and I have been collaborating on LinkedIn, and if you're not following Sarah or me, please do so, because we share one of these at least once a week, and we talk about different things that we've seen in the wild. And I'm telling you, everything on this list has been witnessed in the wild. I'm not going to read through all 10 of them. They're just there for your enjoyment right now, but I'll give you a couple of my favorites. The first favorite of mine is number 4, hide things from your auditors. What they don't know is not going to hurt you, right? Wrong. Your auditors are there to identify areas of improvement, right? If you are hiding things from your auditor, you are cheating yourself. So let them bubble those things up, because sometimes it takes an auditor's report to present to executive leadership to say, see, I told you, this is something that we need to address. So arm yourself with that auditor's report so that you guys can get better, your organization can get more mature. Sarah, what's one of your favorites?
Let hackers be your pen testers. I love this one. And I love this one because we do it.
I know we do.
Y'all, because here's the thing. Penetration tests are not vulnerability tests. Vulnerability tests are not penetration tests. we may be doing periodic vulnerability scanning to understand what our technical vulnerabilities are. We're doing those large like walkthroughs of these questionnaires to understand what our non-technical vulnerabilities are. But a penetration test is an actual penetration test. You pay somebody a lot of money to try to hack into your network. Now then, I don't believe that everybody should do penetration testing. You're a small independent clinic. One, you cannot afford it. Two, your attack surface is not probably big enough, and you can probably do a really good job just on the vulnerability scanning side of things. But if you're a large hospital or even a small hospital, you should really consider periodic pen testing, and that should be driven by your business impact assessment that determines how big your attack surface is, and make sure that you understand where a hacker is going to think you're vulnerable, not where your patches are lacking.
So when you say attack surface, what do you mean by that?
Oh, you mean everybody doesn't know that term? You're probably right. So
I didn't know what it was, a few years ago until we started talking security, but yeah.
Yeah, so an attack surface, in my opinion and how I view it, is how many like devices you have networked together, how big is your network, how many servers do you have, just basically how much do you have that you're feeding, right, and that you're accessing. And so every time you add a new like software vendor, that expands your attack surface. Every time you add a new workstation, that expands your attack surface. Every time you add a new employee, that expands your attack surface. So that's what your attack surface is.
That's perfect. I like to use the analogy of a building, right? If you have one door in the front, that's a very secure building, right? There's only one place for people to come in and come out.
Yep.
But that's never the case, right? You have windows on the side. You might have a garage. You might have a back door to the backyard. Windows on the upstairs and downstairs. And so any of those places that allow people in or out of your organization or your infrastructure, that is your attack surface, right? So ways to increase security is to minimize the attack surface as much as possible, or wrap some security around those entry points. Let's talk about key takeaways. So a couple of things that we've talked about today. Your organization is unique, and your security should be too. And when we say security, we mean your business impact assessment should be unique. Your risk assessment should be unique. Your business continuity plans should be unique. Just because it worked at your last job or your last organization does not mean that it's appropriate for you here today. So make sure that you're investing the time and the effort to analyze what you guys are doing on a daily basis. And really, you're asking the question, how can we get better? And then, Sarah, once you cover the next one for us.
Yeah, and don't push off for tomorrow what you can do today, right? So we're not buying hamburgers or eating hamburgers today and paying for them tomorrow. Like, we actually have to, it's like a Popeye reference. I freaking love Wimpy. I love Popeye. I'm from Southern Illinois, which, in case y'all didn't know, is where Popeye was invented in Chester. But anyway, you cannot push everything off, right? If you see something that you can get done today, do it. If you can't do it today, then start planning and strategizing if you need to loop other people in, right? These are things that you need to actually start taking care of. And so it's almost like the Disney resort approach, right? So if you see a piece of trash on the floor, you pick it up, you throw it away if you're a Disney employee. If you are an employee of your hospital and you see a security or a compliance issue, then you need to, address it immediately to keep it looking and running smoothly.
Absolutely. If you don't have car insurance when you get into a car accident, after the accident, you're kind of out of luck. So make sure that you're insured beforehand. Make sure that you have a business continuity plan. Make sure you have a risk assessment so that you're thinking about these things, right? And then it becomes very important that you test these plans, whether it's your business continuity plan or your incident response plan. Getting through the exercises, right? It's gonna teach you where your shortcomings are, right? So that you can course correct and make improvements, right? Don't wait till you have an outage or a breach to find out that you don't know who to contact, right? Or you don't know who's handling the remediation of the breach, right? Make sure that you get the right people in the room, and if you don't have the right people in the room, that's one of the things that you can correct, right? So also business continuity plans. Test your failover, right? Don't just move it and move it back. Move it over there. Let it run in your DR environment for a little while. Make sure that you have the capacity, right? And then execute the failback, right? Because you'll learn different lessons on the failback than you do on the failover. So be thoughtful about it, take notes, and then make improvements. And then the last one, working from home doesn't mean you stop working collaboratively or securely, right? We just need to adopt with things as they come along, right? New technology isn't always bad. It's just we have to implement it thoughtfully, right? And with a measure of security, right? So there's your key takeaways. If you need more information about the things that Armor can do for you and your business, visit Armor Resources or armor.com/resources. There are case analysis, there are business cases, there's data sheets, there are white papers, tons of information for you to get there. And also, if you need more information on HIPAAtrek and the wonderful things that they can do for your organization, the link at the bottom of the page here is going to help you out tremendously. They too have a wealth of information on their website. You can get a call with Armor and HIPAAtrek if that's what you want. Don't be shy about contacting Sarah or myself if you guys have questions. And speaking of questions, let's go to the Q&A.
Awesome. So we have 2 comments already. So when we were talking about the Alexa and smart devices, somebody made the comment, it's like an old mob movie where the mob has a police bug listening to their plans. I love that analogy. I think that's hilarious. I never thought of it that way. I love it. And we have another comment, except these devices spam you with advertisements for food or other things discussed. And that is how we know that they're always listening, because all of a sudden you're talking and then you log into the Amazon app, you're talking about pink hippos, and all of a sudden there's a ton of advertisements for pink hippos.
It's creepy, is it? Yeah. Isn't it?
It's so creepy. It's so creepy. All right. So thank you, Jared, for those 2 amazing comments. I loved them. So does anybody else have any questions?
I have a story to tell you. I got together with a buddy of mine. We went to the Armed Forces Bowl, and he was a Navy grad from the Naval Academy, and some of the people that we were with were also from the Naval Academy, because Armed Forces Bowl, Navy was playing, right? And so they're talking about things that they do in their normal everyday job. And one guy is a director within the FBI, and he was actually putting surveillance devices in a mobster's house, right? And he's up there and he's like installing it in an electrical outlet, right? And for some reason, the guy that owns the apartment, he turned around and was coming back up, and they're like on the horn, you gotta get out of there, gotta get out of there. He's coming up the stairs, and he said he finished up and got out of the apartment and passed him on the staircase going down, And I was just like, I was overwhelmed by that story, and I was like, like, what about you, Mike? And I'm like, yeah, we had a web server crash last week, so that was exciting.
That's crazy.
And I'm just like, man, there are people with jobs out there that are so incredibly interesting, that I don't know. That's just, the story really, really was interesting to me, and then realized that my life is inadequate. No, but let's not get into that right now. Do we not? Do we not have anybody?
Yeah, so we have another comment. So somebody would like to set up a private call. That's amazing. On the next slide, we actually have our contact information, right? I believe. Yes, well, our website. Okay, so my email address is Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, @HIPAAtrek.com. Mike, what's yours?
Mike.Anand@armor.com.
Yes. So I will actually just send those over really quickly. And then we can actually get a private call set up.
All right, so we have another question about the business impact assessment. Yeah. The question is, should we do the BIA only on high risk? And I would say no. If you're doing a thorough assessment, like I said, right, you will not have one solution for everything, right? So absolutely, you're going to have to identify the high risk, but the lower risk items, applications, they need business continuity too. You can't exclude them. Those things might be like email, right? Business relies on email to communicate. Very important, but it's not something that people are going to lose life over if it's not available for 30 minutes, right? Completely different
Right.
Business continuity plan for those lower tier applications, right? So, like I said, be honest with yourself, make sure that you're addressing the high risk, but you need to address the low risk too, okay?
Right. And I think that, like, Waleed, it's super important for us to, like, remember that a business impact assessment or analysis is not a risk analysis, right? It is really to understand how your business units are going to interact with the rest of the organization, which is not what a risk assessment does. Now, then there will be elements that look a lot risk analysis-ish, right? But they're, I make up words all the time, y'all. But,
I like that.
But it's a whole other, like, element of things that needs to be done. And Waleed, if you need assistance on this, like, please feel free to contact Mike or I. Both of us can actually help walk through, like, some high level elements that need to be included in a BIA, regardless of which business unit you're actually assessing at the time. We can actually give some good points on that. So just contact one of us. We'd be happy to help you. Yeah. We actually
and
love
really,
talking.
it's one of those things that kind of never ends, right? Because as soon as you
Right.
think you're finished, everything's changed quite a bit, right? Technology changes, patches are installed, resources are utilized, technology degrades over time. So you're going to have to keep reviewing things, right? New application, different business units will have new applications. And so you're going to have to do your assessment on an ongoing basis. So I recommend that it might be something that you use to interact with the business side and IT on a monthly basis. What are the things that are most important to the business today, right? Because those are the things that you're going to want to put in your budget and you're going to want to address down the road, right? And so, like I said earlier, IT is a support organization of the business, right? And the business will tell you what's driving them on any given day or moment. And IT's function is to address those things. So
Right.
don't be shy about talking to people. Sorry, go ahead.
I know, and there's a big way, like, there's so many different ways you can do your BIA, right? Like, if you really want to just focus in on IT, you can do an IT BIA for every single business unit. If you want to do one that's way more holistic in general, you can do that. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can approach this BIA that it really depends on what your goals are. What is your goal of doing that assessment? And it's the same thing when you're looking at your security risk analysis. What is your end goal? What is it that you're trying to accomplish when you're creating your cybersecurity program in general? What is your end goal? And that's how you're going to be able to create it. And that's why Mike stressed why it's so important to create something that's unique to you, and why what will work for you today may not work for you tomorrow, and definitely won't work for you if you go to an entirely different organization with a different infrastructure, with a different culture, with a different set of folks. Like, you have to make sure that you're addressing this kind of on this ongoing basis.
Absolutely. And it's also why you can't get it done in a week, right? Really, you need to spend a lot of time doing the analysis and having those conversations. So
Absolutely.
It looks like we're over time a little bit, so let me take this opportunity, Sarah, to thank you so much. I know you're on vacation today, and so it's really very meaningful to me that you would take the time out of your vacation to join me and talk to all these fine folks that took time out of their day to give us their attention. And so I want to thank you first and foremost, Sarah, but I'd also like to thank everybody in the audience for attending. Please don't hesitate to email us if you have questions. Sarah and I are both very accessible and encourage you to reach out to us so that we can continue this conversation. So thank you once again, Sarah, and thank you everybody for attending. We hope you enjoyed our little webinar today, and we hope you found it enjoyable. Until next time, we'll see you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.